Hebrews chapter 11, verses 20 through 40. Verse 20. By faith Isaac blessed Jacob and Esau concerning things to come. Burkett notes, note that there is a blessing by way of prayer and a blessing by way of prophecy, foretelling what shall befall persons in times to come. Of this kind is Isaac's blessing. The patriarchs were in a particular manner directed and guided by God, and their blessing was a conferring of a right to the parties blessed. Thus Isaac blessed Jacob and Esau concerning things to come, that is, concerning the great and future things which should happen to their posterity after them. Note here, Esau's, wicked men, have their portion in outward blessings as well as Jacob's, as well as the best and holiest of men, partly as they are God's creatures, partly as they are descended from parents in covenant with God, and partly because they make some profession of the name of God. And God will be behindhand with none, but so far as they do good, they shall see good. Verse 21. By faith Jacob, when he was dying, blessed both the sons of Joseph and worshipped, leaning upon the top of his staff. Burkett notes, observe here, in dying Jacob, the frame and carriage of holy men in their dying seasons to bless their children and worship their God. Jacob blessed Joseph and his 2 sons, laying hold on the covenant made with Abraham. It's no small privilege to be born of parents taken into visible covenant with God, and no small comfort when God comes to take away such parents from us to have the benefit of their blessings and prayers. Jacob, when dying, blessed both the sons of Joseph, and as he blessed them, so he worshipped God with religious worship and in a devout manner, leaning upon the top of his staff. Learn hence that our addresses to God ought to be exceedingly reverent, both as to the frame of our souls and also to the gesture of our bodies. We cannot always be affectionate in prayer, for affection depends upon the vigorous motions of the bodily spirits, but we should always be reverent and serious in prayer. Otherwise, it is no worship. Learn farther that where faith gives a willing mind, bodily infirmities shall be no let and hindrance from duty. Verse 22. By faith, Joseph, when he died, made mention of the departing of the children of Israel and gave commandment concerning his bones. Burkett notes, here we have a twofold instance of Joseph's faith when dying. One, he made mention of the departing of the children of Israel. He said unto his brethren, Behold, I die, but God shall bring you into the land which he has sworn unto your fathers. See how the good man dies in the faith of the promise. Learn thence that it is of singular use and great advantage to the church that such believers as have been eminent in profession should in their dying moments testify their faith in the promises of God. So did Jacob before, so did Joseph now. The second instance or evidence of Joseph's faith was that he gave commandment concerning his bones. That is, he took an oath of his brethren that they should carry his bones out of Egypt and bury them in Canaan, thereby owning and professing himself to be of the posterity of Abraham, and thereby also encouraging the faith and expectation of his brethren and their posterity to hope for their deliverance out of Egypt and to be put into the possession of the promised land, so that it is evident that there was faith, much faith, showed by Joseph in disposing of his bones. The papists' plea from hence for paying veneration to their relics is weak and contemptible. This was a special charge given in faith to do what was done, and to shut them up in a coffin and decently bury them was all that was done. Now to take example from hence, to dig men's bones out of their graves, to enshrine them and place them upon altars, to carry them in procession, to adore them, to ascribe miraculous operations to them, casting out devils and the like, is fond and ridiculous. Verse 23. By faith Moses, when he was born, was hid 3 months of his parents, because they saw he was a proper child, and they were not afraid of the king's commandment. Burkett notes, in these words, the faith of Moses' parents is celebrated. The birth of Moses fell out in the very height and fury of Pharaoh's persecution, when the king had given commandment to destroy all the male children. Moses was then born and hid by his parents and preserved as a deliverer of the church of God. Oh, how blind are all the persecutors and opposers of the church of God when they think all things secure and their counsels so deeply laid that God himself cannot deliver out of their hands. Then doth the Almighty lay in provisions for his church's deliverance and their destruction. Now was Moses a deliverer born and hid. But observe a double cause of Moses' hiding. The first, external. They saw he was a proper child. They had a persuasion that God would provide a person to be their deliverer, and they saw something divine in Moses to stir up their faith and raise their expectations that he might be the person. The second, the internal and moving cause. They were not afraid of the king's commandment or bloody decree. Learn hence, 1, that the commands of kings and princes have oftentimes been a very great trial to the children of God. So was Nebuchadnezzar's command to worship the golden image, and such was Pharaoh's command here. Learn, 2, that kings and princes must not be obeyed in things contrary to the word of God. Obedience without reserve is to be paid to none but God. They were not afraid of the king's commandment. Verses 24 through 26. By faith, Moses, when he was come to years, refused to be called the son of the Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to suffer affliction with the people of God than to enjoy the pleasures of sin for a season, esteeming the reproach of Christ greater riches than the treasures in Egypt, for he had respect unto the recompense of the reward. Burkett notes, the next person whom our apostle instances in is Moses himself, whose faith and self-denial were most evidently conspicuous in all the instances of them. Observe 1, his great self-denial with all the enhancing circumstances of it. When he came to years, he refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter. Note here, 1, the circumstance of time. When he came to years, it was no childish act when he knew not what he did, but when he came to age and understanding. Nay, farther, this was when Moses was newly come to age, in the prime and vigor of his time, when he had just begun to taste the sweetness of youthful pleasures. The world appears a dead and dry thing in the winter of old age, but looks green and beautiful in the spring of youth. But Moses, when just come to years, refused it. Note, 2, the circumstances of his education. He had been bred from a child in a princely way and manner. He never knew what belonged to a low estate. Those that never had much forsake but little when they forsake all. Want will never much pinch those who never understood plenty. But those who have enjoyed fullness all their days, for them to stoop voluntarily from the height of ease and honor to the depth of affliction and hardship is admirable. Thus did Moses. He refused honor and chose affliction. Note 3, the circumstances of his obligations. Pharaoh's daughter had saved his life, adopted him for her son, given him a princely breeding. He was learned in all the wisdom of the Egyptians, and set her heart upon him as her own. However, Moses breaks through all, and away he goes. But whither went he? Why, to a company of poor bondmen laboring at the brick kilns, and to take his lot of suffering with them. Note 4, the circumstances of his expectations. How very fair and certain a prospect he had of enjoying the crown of Egypt. He did not refuse it because he despaired of attaining it, for he was an adopted heir unto it. Note lastly, that all this was not a rash and sudden determination, but a deliberate and advised choice. Acts 7:23. St. Stephen said he made this choice when he was full 40 years old. That is, when he was of ripest judgment, and in the height of prosperity and reputation. He did not only, as Joseph says, at 3 years old cast a crown given to him for a play toy to the ground and trample it under his feet, but, as the apostle says here, when he came to be a man, he treated it with no more respect, but refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter. Behold here Moses' faith and imminent self-denial in choosing rather to suffer affliction with the worshippers of the true God than to gain a kingdom by renouncing God and his holy religion. From whence learn that faith is a grace which will teach and enable a person openly to renounce all worldly advantages at God's call, when we cannot enjoy them with an upright mind and a good conscience. Question: but how did Moses come to know his stock and race? That he was a Hebrew born and not an Egyptian, no son of Pharaoh's daughter? Answer: he found himself circumcised, and so belonged to the circumcised people. The token of God's covenant received in infancy, duly considered, is a most effectual means to preserve persons in the profession of the true religion. Add to this that his mother was his nurse, and continually with him, and probably his father frequently, who, being persons fearing God, took care very early to impress him with the principles of the true religion, and with the detestation of the Egyptian idolatry. Verse 25. Choosing rather to suffer affliction with the people of God than to enjoy the pleasures of sin for a season. Burkitt notes, observe here, 1. The common lot and usual condition of God's people in this world. It's an afflicted state and condition. 2. That wicked men ofttimes enjoy pleasures in the ways of sin, whilst good men meet with much affliction in the work of holiness. 3. That notwithstanding this, all wise and good men do rather choose afflicted godliness than pleasant and prosperous wickedness. 4. That a spiritual eye can see an excellency in the people of God when in the lowest suffering condition, will join itself unto them, and appear with them and for them, though it be with great loss and much hazard. Moses here chose rather to suffer affliction with the people of God than to enjoy the short, sinful pleasures of the Pharaoh's court. Verse 26. Esteeming the reproach of Christ greater riches than the treasures in Egypt, for he had respect unto the recompense of the reward. Burkitt notes, the former verse acquainted us with the general choice which Moses made of affliction with the people of God. This acquaints us with one sort and particular kind of affliction which he chose, namely, reproach for Christ. This he counted his glory, his riches, his treasures beyond all the riches and treasures of Egypt. Note here that the people of God have been and usually are a people under reproach, not only a persecuted, but a reproached people. The foundation of all suffering is laid in reproach. This is the cover for all. The Jews, by reproaches, first stirred up the rage of the people against Christ, before they attempted to take away his life. Note, too, the reproach of good men is the reproach of Christ, because he and they are but one mystical body, and because of the near union that is between them. The reproach of the wife is the reproach of the husband, especially if she be reproached for his sake and upon his account. Again, observe what a high esteem a gracious person has of reproaches in the cause of Christ and for the sake of Christ. He esteems them his glory, his treasure, his greatest treasure. He rejoices and takes pleasure in them, and very much values himself by them. Verily, no man deserves the name of a Christian until he hath such an esteem of Christ and value for him, that the worst things in the world, even persecution and reproach, should be preferred by him before the great things of the world, when they stand in competition with him or in opposition to him. Observe lastly, the ground of Moses' faith, self-denial, contempt of the world, and all its excellent actions. And that was the recompense of the reward which he had respect unto. For he had respect unto the recompense of the reward. For note that there is a reward laid up for good men, that it is lawful, yea, laudable, very expedient, yea, very necessary and needful for a Christian to eye this reward, and to have respect unto it in the whole course of his obedience. And this doing will be a mighty encouraging motive to undergo all hardships and difficulties in the way of religion. He had respect unto the recompense of the reward. Verses 27 through 29. By faith he forsook Egypt, not fearing the wrath of the king, for he endured as seeing him who was invisible. Through faith he kept the Passover and the sprinkling of the blood, lest he that destroyed the firstborn should touch them. By faith they passed through the Red Sea, as by dry land, which the Egyptians, essaying to do, were drowned. Burkitt notes, our apostle, having described the faith of Moses with respect to his sufferings with the people of God in the former verses, comes now to instance the power and activity of it, with respect to their deliverance in these verses. Where note 1, the spiritual fortitude which attended his faith. He forsook Egypt, not fearing the wrath of the king. Even the wrath of the greatest king upon earth is to be disregarded if it lies against our duty to God. Note 2, the reason or ground of this his fortitude and courage. He endured as seeing him who was invisible. That is, he saw him by faith, whom he could not see by sense. He saw him in his omnipresence, power, faithfulness, and had a fixed trust in him at all times and on all occasions. Learn hence that there is nothing insuperable to faith while it can keep a clear view of the power of God and the promise of God. Note 3. The commendation of Moses' faith from a due observation of a double ordinance of worship, namely, the Passover and the sprinkling of blood. As to the former, Moses' faith in keeping the Passover had respect to its divine institution, to the command for its perpetual observation, to the sacramental nature of it, to the mystical or typical signification of it. Learn hence that a vigorous and lively exercise of faith is always required unto the right and due celebration of a sacramental ordinance. By faith he kept the Passover. It follows, and the sprinkling of blood. This was a temporary ordinance and observation annexed to the first celebration of the Passover, not repeated afterwards. The sprinkling of the blood on the side posts of their houses was a token that the destroying angel should pass over those houses, and that none should be destroyed in them. But this rite, though it ceased with the first Passover, yet it abides forever in its mystical signification, God hereby teaching us that unless we are sprinkled with the blood of Christ, our paschal lamb, no other privilege can secure us from the displeasure of God and everlasting destruction. By faith he kept the Passover and the sprinkling of blood. Verse 28. Note 4. Farther instance of the power and efficacy of Moses' faith in passing through the Red Sea. Verse 29. Probably he entered first into the sea at the head of the people himself, both to conduct them and to encourage. The water doubtless was raised to a very great height on both sides of them, and though they were a wall unto them, yet it was a mighty act of faith to put themselves between such walls as were ready every moment to fall upon them, had they not been under an almighty restraint. Learn hence that faith will overcome all fears and dangers and find a way through a sea of difficulties under the call and at the command of God. But how came it to pass that the Egyptians, going in the same path through the Red Sea, were drowned, in which the Israelites were preserved? Answer: the Egyptians entering in was an act of presumption. The Israelites was an act of faith. God commanded the Israelites to go through. Now, as faith gives courage to obey God in difficult duties, so it gives encouragement to hope that safety shall evermore accompany duty. Verse 30. By faith the walls of Jericho fell down, after they were encompassed about 7 days. Burkett notes, after the faith of Moses and the Israelites at the Red Sea, we have here the faith of Joshua and the Israelites before Jericho, recorded and related. Jericho was a walled and well-fenced city, and a frontier town that kept them from entering into Canaan. God commanded them not to fight, but to walk, to go around the city 7 days, and he would give them an unexpected entrance into it. They believe and obey, and success was according to their desire. By faith, the walls of Jericho fell down, etc. Here note 1, the grace exercised. Faith. They believed God upon his word. They entered Canaan at this frontier town. God remembers his promise and disappoints not the faith and expectation of his people. Note 2, the readiness and exactness of the people's obedience. They encompass the town so many days, they do what God commands, and no more. Here is no mount raised, no engine planted, no sword drawn. They only walk, not fight. Doubtless the men of Jericho made themselves merry with this sight, and said to one another, "What, will these men beat down our city with their eyes? Will they conquer us only by gazing upon us?" And farther, as the army only must encompass the city, so must the priests blow the ram's horns, a contemptible means. Had they made use of the silver trumpets of the sanctuary, that had been a good ground to hope for success, they being the symbols and sacred signs of God's presence with them. But verily, trumpets of ram's horns seem more fit to move laughter than to do execution. Yet, assuredly, no ram of iron could have been so forcible for battery as these ram's horns, when God had appointed them. It is the praise of omnipotency oftentimes to work improbabilities. Note 3, the event and success which followed their faith and accompanied their obedience. The walls of Jericho fell down. Nothing can stand before the power of God and the faith of his people. If we will believe God's promises and execute his commands, we need no shifts, nor artifice, no power or policy of our own to work deliverance for us. Learn hence that when faith makes use of the means prescribed by God, though it cannot discern what influence the means can have to the end aimed at, yet the issue and event shall certainly be according to God's appointment and faith's expectation. By faith the walls of Jericho fell down, after, etc. Verse 31. By faith the harlot Rahab perished not with them that believed not, when she had received the spies with peace. Burkett notes, observe here, 1. The person spoken of, Rahab, a Gentile, an Amorite, a harlot who kept a victualling house in Jericho, and was both harlot and hostess, defiled both in body and mind with idolatry and adultery. 2. What is spoken of her, she believed, by faith, Rahab, etc. She was converted to God before the spies came to her, by what she heard of him and his mighty works. Behold here a blessed instance, 1. Of the sovereignty and freedom of God's grace, 2. Of the power and efficacy of divine grace in calling and converting a person given up by her own choice to the vilest of sins, even to the ravings of lust. But no sinner nor sin is to be despaired of in whose cure sovereign grace is engaged. Observe 3. The effect and fruit of her faith. She received the spies with peace. That is, entertained them safely, concealed them, gave them intelligence, exposed herself to danger in the conveyance of them. An imminent fruit, a special evidence, and a high demonstration of her faith. Indeed, she told an officious lie, but God pardoned it, and the apostle here makes no mention of it. The Holy Ghost lays, as it were, the finger upon the scar, and covers it out of sight, contrary to the practice of the malignant world, who overlook all the good and reflect only upon the evil of an action, whereas God takes notice of the good, but passes by the evil. Observe 4. The benefit and advantage she received by her faith. She perished not. That is, when the credulous and idolatrous people of Jericho were destroyed, she and her family were preserved. From the whole learn 1. That God is ready to show wonderful mercy to penitent sinners, if they return to him and believe in him, how great soever their sins have formerly been. Learn 2. That true faith, wherever it is, will show itself by some eminent effect and notable fruits of it. Learn 3. That the rewards of faith are excellent and truly glorious. As she was preserved from the common ruin at Jericho, so shall all believers be saved from that wrath and destruction which shall come ere long upon the impenitent and unbelieving world. Verses 32 to 35. And what shall I say more? For the time would fail me to tell of Gideon, and of Barak, and of Samson, and of Jephthah, of David also, and Samuel, and of the prophets, who through faith subdued kingdoms, wrought righteousness, obtained promises, stopped the mouths of lions, quenched the violence of fire, escaped the edge of the sword, out of weakness were made strong, waxed valiant in fight, turned to flight the armies of the aliens. Women received their dead raised to life again. Burkett notes, in these and the following verses, our apostle sums up the remaining testimonies which he might have produced to show the great things which faith had assisted persons to do, and also enabled them to suffer the hardest and most terrible things that could be encountered with. In the verses now before us, an account is given us of the great things of all sorts which faith has enabled to do. Particularly it was faith that made them fearless whom God raised up in the days of the judges to conflict with the enemies of the church. It was faith that assisted them in the combat and rendered them victorious in the conflict. It was faith rendered Gideon successful over the Midianites, Barak over the Canaanites, Samson over the Philistines, Jephthah over the Amorites, David over the Jebusites and Moabites. It was faith in the promise of God that made them courageous and rendered them victorious. There is nothing so great, so difficult, or unseemingly inseparable that should hinder us from acting faith in all things, even things more great and excellent than the conquest of earthly kingdoms. Observe next, our apostle having enumerated the persons believing, he now reckons up the noble acts and honorable achievements of their faith. Through faith they subdued kingdoms. So did Joshua subdue all the kingdoms of Canaan. and David all the kingdoms about it, viz. Moab, Ammon, Edom, Syria, and the Philistines. These were subdued by faith because what they did was in obedience to God's command and in the accomplishment of his promises, for he had given all those kingdoms by promise to the Israelites before they were subdued by them. Thus they are said to subdue kingdoms by faith. Yet note that they made use of all other heroic virtues besides faith: courage, valor, military skills, and military stratagems. Faith excites all graces and virtues and puts them in motion. Wrought righteousness. They executed the judgment of God on the enemies of the church and administered justice impartially to all that were under their rule and government. And this working righteousness is a fruit of faith, for unbelief is the cause of all the injustice and oppression that's in the world. Obtained promises, that is, the good things promised. So did Abraham by faith obtain a promised son, Joshua a promised Canaan, David a promised kingdom. But there was a great space of time between the promise and the performance, which put their faith sometimes hard to it. Stop the mouths of lions. Thus Daniel, chapter 6, because he believed in his God, verse 23, and the faith which heretofore stopped the mouths of lions can stop the rage of the most savage oppressors and persecutors whenever God pleases. Quench the violence of fire. So did the three children's faith, Daniel 3. Not a hair on their head was singed. They knew not which way God would deliver them, but they committed themselves to the omnipotency and sovereignty of God in the discharge of their duty, with a full persuasion that one way or the other he would deliver them. Escaped the edge of the sword, as did David, the sword of Goliath, and Saul, though sometimes his fear prevailed that he should one day perish by the sword of Saul. Fear may be in cases of danger, and yet faith at the same time have the principal conduct of the soul. By faith David escaped the edge of the sword. So did the Jews the sword of Haman, and Elijah the sword of Jezebel. Out of weakness were made strong. Some apply this to Gideon and his 300 men, Judges 7:15. Others to Hezekiah, who by the power of faith was in a wonderful manner recovered and restored from a desperate sickness to perfect health. Isaiah 38, waxed valiant in fight. So did Joshua, Gideon, Barak, Jephthah, and David, who through faith in the promise and of the presence of God with them, feared neither the number nor strength of their enemies. David often declares that God girded him with strength to the battle, and taught his hands to war and his fingers to fight, so that though a host encamped against him, yet his heart was not afraid, turned to flight the enemies of the aliens. Those aliens were the heathens and idolaters, Philistines and Medanites, who were enemies to Israel and to the God of Israel, and they made them fly and turn their backs. For as they fought for God out of principle of faith, so God fought for them according to the faithfulness of his promise, which was the ground of their confidence and courage. Women received their dead raised to life again. This applies to the widow of Zarephath and the Shunammite, 2 Kings 4:36, 1 Kings 17:23. They were raised by the prophet's faith and rejoiced by their mother, when raised, with joy and thankfulness. These 10 instances did the apostle select and choose out of many to give of the great things that had been done through faith, thereby to assure the Hebrews, and us with them, that there's nothing too hard nor difficult for faith to effect when it's set upon work and managed according to the power of God. Verse 35 continued through 38. And others were tortured, not accepting deliverance, that they might obtain a better resurrection. And others had trials of cruel mocking and scourging, yea, moreover of bonds and imprisonment. They were stoned, they were sawn asunder, were tempted, were slain with the sword. They wandered about in sheepskins and goatskins, being destitute, afflicted, tormented, of whom the world was not worthy. They wandered in deserts and in mountains and in dens and caves of the earth. Burkett notes, our apostle, having in the foregoing verses acquainted the Hebrews with the great things which faith enabled the Old Testament saints to do, he now lays before them an account of the hard and difficult things which faith enabled them to suffer, and here reckons up the sharpest and bitterest sufferings that human nature perhaps can be exposed to. But to do the greatest things and to suffer the hardest is all one to faith. Faith stands ready for both, as God shall call. Observe here in general that the evils enumerated are of such various sorts and kinds as to comprise everything that may befall believers on account of their Christian profession. Do we meet with temptations, scorns, and mockings, scourging, bonds, imprisonment, yea, death itself, by all sorts of tortures and extremities? This is our encouragement that others in the cause of God have undergone them and been carried victoriously through them. But the particulars in this little book of martyrs follow. Others were tortured, not accepting deliverance. In this passage, and several others here following, the apostle is concluded to refer to the story in the Maccabees, which, though written after the closing of the canon of the Scripture, when there was no extraordinary prophet in the church, yet the matters of fact were then fresh in memory, and are here alluded to, particularly Eleazar, 2 Maccabee 6:28, who was beaten to death when he'd been persuaded and allured to accept deliverance by transgressing the law, and also the mother and her 7 sons. They expected a better resurrection, better than what their persecutors offered them, even a glorious resurrection of their bodies at the last day. Others had trials of cruel mocking, as Micah, 1 Kings 22:24, and others, and scourgings, as Jeremiah, chapter 20, verse 2, etc., and chapter 37:15. Also bonds and imprisonment, as Joseph in Egypt and Jeremy in the dungeon. Some were stoned, as Zechariah the son of Joadiah, 2 Chronicles 24:21. Others sawn asunder, as Isaiah under the tyranny of Manasseh. Others were tempted with fair promises and great rewards, but, refusing, were slain with the sword. Learn hence that torments in the cause of religion have been a very old invention of the devil and the world, and they've placed great hopes of prevailing by them. But no instruments of cruelty, no endeavors of hell, shall ever prevail against the faith of God's elect. They wander about in sheepskin and goatskin, destitute, afflicted, tormented. This some refer to Elijah, who was destitute and fed by ravens, 1 Kings 17:4. But it has been the portion of many of God's faithful servants to be driven from their habitations, sometimes by the cruelty of the law, sometimes by force and violence, of whom the world was not worthy. That is, the men of the world think saints of God not worthy to live amongst them, whereas the world is not worthy of such excellent company. And therefore, as soon as their work is done, God removes them. Learn hence, 1, that God's esteem of his people is nevertheless because of their outward suffering and calamities, whatever the world would judge of them. They esteem them the filth of the world and the off-scourging of all things, but God is of another mind. Learn 2, let the world think as highly and proudly of itself as it pleases. God thinks it, at all times, but especially when it persecutes his people, base and unworthy of their society. They wander in deserts and mountains. Behold here the state and condition of some of the servants of the living God, who, when driven from all inhabited places, took up their lodging in deserts and mountains, in dens and caves of the earth. Learn hence that oftentimes it's much better and more safe for the saints of God to be in a wilderness among the beasts of the field than in a savage world inflamed by the devil into rage and persecution. Verse 39. And these all, having obtained a good report through faith, receive not the promise. Burkitt notes, that is, all the forementioned Scripture saints, with others that have lived from the beginning of the world and the first giving out of the promise of the Messiah, Genesis 3:15, all and every one of these obtained a good report through faith. That is, a good testimony that they pleased God. Nevertheless, they received not the promise. That is, the actual exhibition of the promise, Christ, the promised Messiah. The promise they had, but not the thing promised. This was not in their day exhibited. Christ was not then come in the flesh. This promise was made by God to the elders from the beginning, but not actually accomplished until the fullness of time. Learn hence that the Old Testament saints had from the beginning the promise of God concerning the exhibition of Christ in the flesh for the redemption of the world, which promise they were persuaded of the truth of, embraced it with desire, longing for the actual accomplishment of it, and thus enjoyed the benefit of it as well as we. Verse 40. God having provided some better thing for us, that they without us should not be made perfect. Burkett notes, the better thing here spoken of is the coming of Christ in the flesh. Lord, what were we and how are we better than they, that this better thing should be reserved for us? They saw the promise afar off. We enjoy it at hand, that they without us should not be made perfect. Without us, inasmuch as without the things which are actually exhibited unto us. God never intended or designed that the infant condition of the church should be made perfect before the exhibition of Christ. That is, that they should be justified and saved by any sacrifices or services done in their time, but looking to the sacrifices and satisfaction of Christ, whereby both they and we are perfected. Learn hence that it is Christ alone who was to give perfection and consummation to his church. All the outward glorious worship of the Old Testament, though it pleased God, yet had no perfection in it. This God reserves for our times, that they, without us, should not be made perfect.